everyone. Welcome to week 11. Dr. Klein here once more with you, and I'm just dropping in today to discuss a few things about the week's topic. And this week we're focusing on the civil court processes. So this week you had to read chapter 11 from the CRIJ text, and then there were a couple more online readings that were additionally assigned. One was from Miller and Surratt from 1980, and the second one was from Viscusi and McMichael, and that was published in 2014. So hopefully you have found both of those. They can be found on the Blackboard website like all of your other assigned readings. So civil cases. This week we're talking about things that are not necessarily criminal but still have legal ramifications for the civil case that's taking place. So civil cases are inherently different than criminal ones. When you are charged in criminal court, it's basically you against the state, right? But for civil cases, when we're talking about this type of format, we're really talking about me versus you, right? And this is not necessarily something that we routinely discuss as criminologists because we don't really focus on these civil matters because we're more interested in what happens when you violate laws of the state, right? So civil cases, like I said, it's a dispute between two individuals compared to the criminal case in which there's this dispute between you and the state, right? And the state is acting as sort of this representative of the people rather than as an individual himself. So when we're talking about civil cases, really what we're talking about is that something has been done, right? I did something to you and you feel as though I owe you some sort of reparations, sorry, it's early in the morning, for the wrong that you think that I have done to you. So for instance, let's think about the O.J. Simpson case, right? This is a famous case. We all know it. It's been on TV recently again. But O.J. Simpson was acquitted in criminal court for the murder of his wife and her friend, Nicole Brown Simpson, and then her friend, Ron Goldman. And after he was famously acquitted for the murder charges, the families of both of those victims actually took him to civil court. And the two families were awarded $25 million in reparations from O.J. Simpson. So this sort of shows that even though criminal remedies sometimes don't work, there still are civil options that are available to the victims. And civil cases sort of run the gamut, right? So when I talk about how I'm going to sue you, I'm really talking about taking you to civil court. And civil cases, like I said, can apply to all different types of wrongs that you feel that I have done to you. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the result of physical injury or death, as we're talking about with the O.J. Simpson case, but it can range from compensation if there was property damage done or a property crime was committed. Like, let's say I ran over your mailbox and hit your tree and I knocked the tree over. You can sue me for the damages that I caused with my vehicle. Workplace, so unlawful firing, or if somebody else was promoted above me even though that person is less qualified. Malpractice is certainly one of them, so medical malpractice. And then again, like I said, the injury or death suits that we constantly see. And companies too. Companies can certainly sue one another for stealing ideas or corporate espionage or whatever it may be. Companies certainly have their hand in the civil arena as well. So we see sort of that there's a lot going on in the civil court structure, and sometimes it's easier to get a civil case in your favor, to win a civil case in your favor, compared to actually securing a criminal conviction. And part of the reason why is the burden of proof that is necessary in both arenas, right? So for instance, what do you need in a criminal case? You need obviously proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the court system doesn't necessarily like to put a numerical figure on what proof beyond a reasonable doubt is, but basically proof beyond a reasonable doubt is that you are pretty much almost absolutely sure that the defendant is guilty, right? There's nothing else in your mind that can convince you that he or she was not the one responsible or was not the one at fault, right? So if we're going to put some kind of numerical marker on it, you probably have to be 90, 95, 99% sure that this is the person who did it and that they are actually guilty and that there's no other possibility that this person could be acquitted, right? So like I said, the court doesn't necessarily like to put that numerical marker on it, but absolute certainty means that you are pretty sure, right? And for civil cases, things are a lot different. The burden of proof is just much lower in general than the criminal court, right? So what do you need in a civil arena? You need to meet the preponderance of evidence, and that's a much lower standard, like I said. And basically what that means is that you have to be 51% sure that the plaintiff, or in this case, the plaintiff is the person who has initiated the case. So if we're thinking about the O.J. Simpson case, we're talking about the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, right? That the families are the plaintiff in that case. So to meet the preponderance of evidence, you have to be 51% sure, which is basically coin flip, right? You have to be 51% sure that O.J. Simpson was responsible for the harm that was caused to these two victims, and that he should pay reparations for the damage that he has done, right? So in that case, obviously the civil courts did decide, the civil jury did decide that O.J. Simpson was at least 51%. They were 51% sure that he was responsible, and awarded the victims' families $25 million in compensation for the loss of their loved ones. So it's, like I said, it's a much lower burden of proof than exists in the criminal court, and it's basically a coin flip as to whether or not you are responsible, right? So when we're talking about compensation, obviously $25 million from one solitary individual is a lot of money, but things really explode when you start talking about corporations. And I think one of the most famous cases obviously is the McDonald's hot coffee case, but there's a lot of other things that are taking place with other companies where you see these massive payoffs that are taking place in the civil arena. And I think one of the most recent civil cases that I can think of is, if you remember a handful of years ago, there was this huge issue with General Motors and their faulty ignition switches. And if you remember, cars were not stopping, cars were catching on fire, people were dying, and at the time there was some indication that GM knew that their ignition switches were faulty and that just simply didn't do anything about it and sort of delayed their recall on the vehicles. And obviously now we know that that was the case for sure, that they did purposely delay the recall in order to not have to pay out or fix the cars that were faulty. And at the time they were trying to play it up as though it was just a few isolated incidents and that it was not this massive thing where it was now impacting nearly every brand of car, every model, make and model car that they made. Right? They were trying to minimize the damages, but then when it started becoming this more large-scale thing and people were dying and people were being injured as a result of GM's cars, it then became a more large-scale national issue, and certainly time for the government and for the civil courts to step in. Right, so as their loved ones were being injured or as their loved ones were dying, families started suing GM in a class action lawsuit. And actually GM had to settle with, I think it was like 124, 26, something like that, families who had people who actually died. And then there was a bunch more, I think somewhere around the 300 ballpark of people who were injured as a result of GM's faulty ignition switches. So between the criminal and the civil cases that GM actually faced, they had to pay upwards of $2 billion in payouts to the government and to these families, and they had to recall somewhere around like 2-3 million cars that all had these problems. So if you don't really remember the GM issues, I encourage you to go look it up online, and I actually have posted a small little video clip on Blackboard from our old friend John Oliver, and he takes a quick look at the GM issues. It's just a little tiny segment in one of his shows. So go enjoy that, but again, remember that that is an HBO show and all of your warnings that come along with it. Okay, so your two readings this week actually are focusing on the corporate responsibility that companies face when they create a product or a service that harms somebody. So what happens when I didn't necessarily mean for my ignition switches to be faulty, but they are, and now I am responsible because I'm the manufacturer? What happens then? There is this discussion of the different legal remedies that companies face in trying to make things right again, so whether or not they are required to accept full responsibility for the damages that they have done, or whether or not there are some other options that are available to them and they don't actually have to admit fault. And you're also going to learn about some of the really big different civil cases that have been tried over the years, and how these cases have then established civil case precedent, which is slightly different than criminal case precedent, and how that precedent will apply to future cases. So I want you to sort of be looking for some of the bigger connections between the CARP text and the 2 online readings for the week, and you're going to be working to connect the dots between the different readings in your discussion boards and your short writing assignment for the week. So please, as always, let me know if there are any questions, concerns about the material, you want to talk anything out even further. I'd be happy to do so with you. So if there's not, then I will see you guys next week well, actually, no, I won't see you next week, because next week you have your writing assignment due to me. So we're going to jump ahead to week 13, and that's when I will see you the next time for lecture. So you all have a good week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks. Bye.